October 22nd, 1937. At the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler receives a guest, a man who, 10 months earlier, was still King of Great Britain. Edward raises his right hand in the Nazi salute, in front of running cameras. The world knows his story as a love story. A king gave up his crown for a twice-divorced American. The woman I love. That's how he said it himself, on the radio, on the 11th of December, 1936. What the world doesn't tell, Edward didn't leave by choice. Edward was pushed out, and 3 years later, everyone in London knew why. Edward had been heir to the throne since 1910. 26 years of preparation. 326 days of rule. That was all. Even as Crown Prince, he stood out. In 1933, he wrote to a German relative that it was not our business to interfere in German domestic politics. And dictators are very popular these days. Perhaps we'll need one ourselves soon. In January 1931, Edward met an American woman at a party. She was introduced to him by Thelma, his then mistress. The American was Wallis Simpson. Early 30s, married to Ernest Simpson, divorced from naval officer Earl Spencer. An old mistress handed him the next one, without knowing what she had set in motion. His father, George V, died on January 20th, 1936. Edward became king. The very next morning, he broke protocol. He watched the proclamation of his own accession from a window of St. James's Palace, together with Wallis Simpson, who was still married. It was the first of many transgressions. He had no interest in state papers. Ministerial audiences bored him. The Foreign Office had to start filtering the red dispatch boxes. Confidential documents the king had seen were turning up in Berlin. Maiton V suspected Wallis of passing them to the German ambassador, Joachim von Ribbentrop. In London, rumors circulated about an affair between Wallis and Ribbentrop. In November 1936, Edward visited the mining villages of South Wales. Standing among desperate, unemployed men, he said, "Something must be done." It was an open attack on the Conservative government. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was alarmed. Edward was not just a king in love. He was a political risk. In October 1936, Wallis was granted her second divorce. Now it was clear. Edward intended to marry her. Baldwin told him 3 things. The government would not accept it. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, would not accept it. The Church of England, of which the king was head, would not accept it. Edward proposed a morganatic marriage. He would remain king, Wallis would not be queen. Refused. On the 3rd of December 1936, the British press broke its silence. 7 days later, the crisis was over. On December 10th, Edward signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere. His 3 brothers signed as witnesses. On the 11th of December, he spoke on the radio. That night, he left Britain. His brother Albert became George VI. On that same evening, 500 followers of Oswald Mosley gathered outside Buckingham Palace. They raised their arms in the fascist salute. They shouted, "We want Edward!" In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels ordered the German press to say nothing about the crisis. Adolf Hitler had hoped Edward would stay on the throne. On the 27th of May, 1937, letters patent settled Edward's new status. He became Duke of Windsor. He was allowed to remain His Royal Highness. Wallis was not. She became Duchess of Windsor, without the title HRH, without the curtsy, without recognition. His sister-in-law Elizabeth, the new queen, had insisted on it. In a letter, she called Wallace a naughty lady. Later, she explained it to the biographer Philip Ziegler more bluntly. "You can't have two kings, can you?" On the 3rd of June 1937, Edward and Wallace married at the Château de Condé in France. Their host was Charles Bedeau, a businessman with close ties to the Nazi Party. No one from the British royal family attended. 4 months later, on the 11th of October 1937, Edward and Wallace arrived in Berlin. Accompanied by Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, received by Ribbentrop, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, dinner at Karenhall, a visit to an SS training school in Pomerania. Edward inspected uniformed SS men. Edward gave the Nazi salute. Repeatedly, in front of cameras. On October 22nd, they met Hitler at the Berghof. Hitler and Edward spoke alone for an hour. Edward called Germany's recovery a miracle, created by one will. On October 28th, Edward wrote a personal letter of thanks to Hitler. The British government was horrified. The pictures traveled around the world. A former British king had given a dictatorship the stamp of dignity. 2 years later, the Second World War began. Edward was given a minor liaison role in France. In February 1940, the German ambassador in The Hague reported to Berlin the Duke had passed Allied deployment plans for Belgium to Germany. Edward denied it later. 3 months after that, the Wehrmacht attacked. Belgium fell first, then France. Edward and Wallace fled via Biarritz to Spain, then to Portugal. Lisbon, July 1940. Britain stood alone against Hitler, and Hitler had a plan for Edward. Codename: Operation Willy. Ordered by Hitler personally. Directed by Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. Carried out by SS Brigade Führer Walter Schellenberg. The goal: to keep Edward in Spain, by kidnap if necessary. Budget: 55 million Reichsmark. Hitler's idea: if Germany conquered Britain, Edward would be reinstalled as a puppet king. Edward hesitated. He spoke with German agents in Lisbon. He held back messages. He waited to see who would win the war. Lord Caldecott warned Prime Minister Churchill in writing. The Duke was well known to be pro-Nazi and could become a center of intrigue. Churchill threatened Edward with court-martial if he did not return to British soil. In August 1940, London found its solution. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas, officially a colonial post. In reality, 7,000 kilometers of Atlantic. Edward himself called the Bahamas a third-class British colony. On August 1st, 1940, he left Lisbon aboard the SS Excalibur. While London burned in the Blitz, Edward moved into Government House in Nassau. Wallace had it re-wallpapered with paper imported from New York. One suite was painted in a color she had mixed herself. In 1941, Edward gave an interview to the American Liberty magazine. He doubted that Britain could defeat Hitler. Churchill was furious. In 1942, labor riots broke out in Nassau. Edward blamed communists and men of Central European Jewish descent. On March 16, 1945, he resigned as governor. 6 weeks later, the war was over. It was not Edward who had become the face of the monarchy. It was George VI, the brother who stuttered, who hated public speaking, who had never wanted to be king. He had stayed in London. He had let himself and his wife be photographed in the ruins. He had endured, and with that, Edward was finished. He did not return. He lived in Paris, in the Villa Windsor, in the Bois de Boulogne, a house the French. Government let him use rent-free. Receptions, memoirs, interviews, shopping trips in New York. visible, but without weight. In 1952, George VI died at the age of 56. Edward came to the funeral. Wallace was not allowed. Queen Mother Elizabeth blamed the two of them for her husband's early death. She never forgave them. In 1957, the Marburg Files were published in the United States. Documents of the German embassy found in Marburg in 1945. They confirmed just how closely the Duke had been entangled with the Third Reich. London had tried to suppress their release. In the 1960s, Edward said about Hitler to a friend, "I never thought Hitler was such a bad chap." On the 18th of May, 1972, Elizabeth II visited her uncle in Paris. Edward rose slowly from his chair and bowed to his queen. 10 days later, he was dead. The world kept the love story. The crown kept the power. And Edward kept the wrong name for his exile: love.